Welcome to Timbo Talks, a weekly podcast about work and play. I'm your host, Tim.
Hello to my listeners. I hope you're well and having a much better October than I am. As I record this episode, leaning against the wall beside me are a pair of wooden crutches, which I now need to use in order to move around because of a misadventure I have suffered in October. More on that later. But my experience in October has made me reflect on the idea of risk and whether we can eliminate it from our lives. I think we've all been collectively convinced or persuaded that we can eliminate risk from our lives because of the COVID situation, the lockdowns, the social distancing, the pivot to remote work and remote learning at school, the daily breathless updates in the media about whether the COVID numbers are going up or down based on our behaviour. I think this situation has convinced us that we can manage society and our lives in such a way that we can eliminate risk. And in fact, if we don't eliminate risk or we don't reduce numbers to zero, it's unacceptable. Anything less than a complete elimination of risk is a failure. Well, I think this is an unhelpful belief because when we do encounter something unforeseen, if we're carrying this belief around with us that we can eliminate risk and something bad happens to us, well, I don't think we're going to be mentally prepared for the effect of unforeseen circumstances. About a week and a half ago, my 13-year-old daughter went ice skating with her friends from high school. This was a big deal for her because it was her first social outing with friends since the whole COVID situation. Now, in New South Wales, the COVID restrictions have been relaxed. Her and her friends are now back at school. They're no longer remote learning over Zoom, but this was the first time they all got together in a social setting in a public space. So they went to a local ice skating rink. Now, before she went, I did have some reservations, not because I thought my daughter was at risk of getting COVID, but I just could not remember the last time she went ice skating. So in my mind, I did not regard her as an accomplished ice skater. But I put my fears aside because I thought mentally it would be good for her to socialise with her friends in a fun setting. So off she went ice skating. I was working from home. My wife was doing something else. So there were other parents from the school who were at the ice rink. So several hours pass and my wife and I receive a phone call from one of the parents. Our daughter has actually had a fall at the end of their ice skating session. She's landed on her left arm and she's in great pain and no one wants to move her. And so we make the decision to call an ambulance. And so paramedics arrive at the ice rink. My wife and I aren't there. The paramedics arrive before us and they assess the situation. They think my daughter's fractured her arm. And so they gently take her out of the ice rink, give her some painkillers, put her in the ambulance and take her to the hospital, where my wife and I meet up with her later. Well, it turns out that my daughter's fall on her arm, it was more than just a fracture. The main bone in her upper arm, the humerus, which is a big bone, it was a complete break. So you imagine the middle of the bone, it's actually snapped. And so then the one bone is now two pieces overlapping. So it was a major break. It actually put stress on one of her major nerves in the arm. And the solution was surgery. So she was put under with anaesthetic. Her upper arm was opened surgically. The break was so bad, a metal plate was inserted into her arm and fixed with screws. And then her arm was sewn back up. And the result was, well, her arm was back together, but now she was in tremendous pain. And because of the stress on her nerve, she had limited movement in her fingers. But the surgeons were confident that that could be managed through physio. And so now she's on the road to recovery. Of course, as parents, my wife and I felt guilty that we let her go ice skating, but the alternative seemed just as cruel, to prevent her from associating with her friends. So before my daughter was discharged from the hospital, she actually had to stay there a week under observation, and I had to work at the same time, so it was really up to my wife to set up a bedside vigil and stay with her those few days in the hospital, which was exhausting for my wife because her sleep was fitful. The nurses, rightly so, come in every hour to observe my daughter's condition, and so my wife had set up a bed on the reclining chair beside my daughter's hospital bed. So I was going back and forth to the hospital to visit my daughter, see how my wife was. And so one of the days I visited the hospital, I came into the ward, saw my daughter, saw my wife, noticed my wife was exhausted, and my wife said, "You know, Tim, I would love some Thai takeaway." Thai is her favourite cuisine, so I got out my phone and I considered getting Uber Eats, but I saw that there was a Thai restaurant across the road from the hospital, and I thought, well, I'll just ring up, I'll order a dish, and I'll go for a walk and pick it up. So I ordered some pad see ew for my wife, and then I left the hospital. I went down in the elevator, I went out onto the street, I had to walk about a block to where the Thai restaurant was. Now, I came to a major intersection, and across the road from me was the Thai restaurant. As I approached the pedestrian crossing, I was still a few metres away from where you cross, but the pedestrian light went green. So I saw the flashing green figure, but I was a few metres away, and I thought, I know, rather than just wait again, I'll run to catch the green light. So I ran, got to the edge of the curb, stepped out onto the road, and as soon as I landed on my right foot, I had this feeling in my right calf, like there was a balloon in my calf, and it was filled with mercury or some thick viscous liquid, and that balloon popped. That was the best way to describe the feeling. And as soon as I felt that pop in my right leg, just pain shot up my leg, and I could no longer stand on the leg. But I was in the middle of the road and I had to do something, so I sort of limped to the other side of the road and reached the Thai restaurant. And I was in agony. Clearly something bad had happened to my leg. Like, despite the pain, I almost laughed because I was just at the hospital, at the side of my daughter's bed. She had just endured a horrible injury. I'm trying to bring some relief to her and my wife by getting a delicious meal from the local takeaway, and just simply the act of crossing the road, I appear to have crippled myself in some way. Nevertheless, I actually make myself go into the Thai restaurant because I've already ordered it on the other side of the road. I might as well take advantage of the situation that I've walked this far. So I wait 10 minutes for the food, and then I slowly make my way back to the hospital. I'm literally dragging my right foot. Sweat is beating on my forehead. The physical exertion just to get back to the hospital is intense. And so what was a 10-minute walk was basically a 30-minute walk back. Really more of a shuffle, I should say. So I get back up to the 7th floor of the hospital, go into the ward, give my wife her meal, and I take her aside and I say, I think I've done something really bad to my leg. Anyway, I end up going to see the doctor. I end up having an ultrasound on the leg, and it turns out I've torn the calf muscle where it meets the tendon. It's about a 3.6 centimetre tear. I think that's about 1.5 inches. And there's really nothing I can do except rest. And walking is very difficult. That's why I now have the crutches. But the whole situation was just ridiculous in the sense that my poor daughter had this horrendous injury that required an operation, and my wife and I were beating ourselves up over that because we let her go ice skating. So the theory was perhaps if she didn't go ice skating, this wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't be in this situation. But when I reflect on what happened to my leg, I wasn't even engaged in risky activity. I wasn't abseiling, I wasn't ice skating, I wasn't playing sport. I simply crossed the road and the muscle in my right leg tore, thus limiting my mobility. There was very little I could have done to mitigate that risk. The point is, things happen that are completely unforeseen. It's not healthy to believe that if something bad happens to us, it's because we've done something wrong or we haven't adequately managed risk. I mean, sometimes shit happens. A day or so after my misadventure on the road, one of my work colleagues was out and about, and he was trying to retrieve his lost cat, which he had found after some time. And his cat, as he tried to retrieve it, bit him. Now, that seems like a minor thing, but the bite or the wound actually became infected, and my work colleague, this is only a day or so after what happened to my right leg, he had to go to hospital for surgery to have a surgical cleanse to remove all the bacteria, all the nasties out of his wound. Now, people don't expect to be hospitalised after trying to pick up the family pet. So, thankfully, my colleague appears to be on the mend. But these intense recent experiences have shown me that unforeseen things happen, and the important thing is, how do we respond to it? Our focus on masks, social distancing, regular washing of our hands with antiseptic hand wash, I think it's hypnotised us into this belief that risk is something we can banish from our lives by just following a few simple steps. Well, a coronavirus is only one of many things that can happen to us. And the question is, how will we deal with the unforeseen when it arrives? Before I began recording this podcast, I'd switched my phone on and I saw a post from a Harvard psychologist and best-selling author, Susan David. I'd never seen a post from her before, but this morning I happened to see hers, and it really resonated. I'll just read to you what she wrote. Let it go can become hold it lightly, and when that happens, the heart expands. This does not mean a passive resignation to fate, but rather a vital engagement with the way things actually are, unfiltered and undistorted by rigid mental lenses. I think that's well said. So when I talk about risk and how we can't completely eliminate it, it's not fatalism. Rather, it's an acceptance that our lives are precious, but there's the element of unpredictability. It's mentally healthy to engage with your life in the condition that is at this moment. It does not mean you shouldn't be pushing for a better life or improving your situation, but it's accepting the way things are at this moment and not beating yourself up over it. In the case of me and my wife, not pounding ourselves for allowing our daughter to socialise with her friends at ice skating, not punishing myself for simply going out for Thai takeaway, leaving the hospital to cross the road and injuring myself. My work colleague not punishing himself for trying to retrieve his lost cat. It's healthy to engage with things the way they are right now. As I record this, I can feel my leg, while in a lot of pain, I know it's a slightly less amount of pain than it was a couple of days ago. That's progress. When I look at my daughter, I can see she can move the fingers in her left hand slightly more than she could when she first broke her arm. That's progress too. An accident or an unforeseen event need not be a setback. Rather, it's an invitation for us to engage in our lives more fully than we did before. It's a signal for us to live our life and not to worry so much about the future. And of course, when we get through whatever the challenge is, we'll appreciate our lives all the more.
Thanks for listening to Timbo Talks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on Spotify or YouTube. Alternatively, please use your favourite podcast app to find Timbo Talks. You can also find me on Twitter or Instagram as Timbo Horan, Timbohoran. Until next time.